Let's begin the axial skeleton by learning bones of the skull. The skull can typically be divided into categories. There's 28 bones total. Uh, the skull is there to protect organs like your brain, also house organs that are involved in your special senses, like vision, hearing and equilibrium, smell and taste. And obviously, the skull is also used to house organs that allow you to chew your food, allow you to breathe in air, allow you to speak, and other functions. The three categories I like to divide the skull into include the cranial bones. Cranial bones, by definition, encase the brain in the cranial cavity. So these 8 bones are going to form that cavity that protects the brain. There are 14 facial bones. The facial bones, as the name suggests, form the majority of your face. These bones form the framework of the face. They include some cavities for special senses, like the orbits for your eyes, the nasal cavity. They help form your oral cavity or mouth, and also have openings for the passage of food and air. Then finally, there are the 6 auditory ossicles, 3 in each ear. Again, we will cover these auditory ossicles when we get to the process of hearing. As you can see, this is a drawing of a skull, and you'll notice that all the bones have been separated out. The joints have been separated. We call this a disarticulated skull. So when we use that word articulated or articulation, that refers to a joint. If this was an articulated skull, all these bones would be put together. So you will be studying a little bit of both. We have plenty of articulated skulls in the lab. We also have a couple sets of disarticulated skulls. And that allows you to really see the actual shape of the individual bones instead of trying to see exactly where they are when the entire skull has been put together. So we're going to begin. The first thing we do typically is use these nice colored drawings of the skull. That allows you to see where one bone is relative to another. It also helps you see which bones might articulate or form joints with one another. Going down your list that you have on bones, you should always be able to identify the bone by name and certain surface markings that that bone might have. A surface marking, again, could be some structure on that bone, whether it be a hole or a slit or a process, and you have a list of all of those surface markings that you should be familiar with. But we're going to begin with a fairly easy one, the frontal bone. The frontal bone is one single bone that forms the anterior portion of the cranium. It also forms much of the orbit, the superior wall of the orbit, and it contains a sinus, a paranasal sinus. That sinus is known as the frontal sinus. Paranasal sinuses are air-filled cavities within bones that surround the nasal cavity, hence the word paranasal. These cavities you might be familiar with. If you've had a sinus infection, you probably know that you get some pain right here in your forehead. You also often get pain right below the eyes because the maxilla also has sinuses. There's 4 bones that have sinuses, the frontal bone being one of those 4. Oops, sorry. There's another structure on the frontal bone that you don't see very well here, but there's a little hole found right here above the orbit. That little hole is called a supraorbital foramen. Supra refers to the fact that it's above. Orbital refers to the orbit. and it is a foramen, which is a hole. The next bone is known as the parietal bone. There are two parietal bones. There's one on the right side of the skull, and there's one on the left side of the skull. They come together and form a joint with one another along the superior portion of the skull. That joint is known as the sagittal suture. But the parietal bones form much of the superior and lateral aspects of the skull. So here's the lateral portion of the skull, then up here is the superior aspect of the skull. It actually forms 4 sutures. We're going to revisit these sutures later on, but we have that sagittal suture. There's also a suture here known as the coronal suture. There's a suture here called the squamous suture, and there's a suture here called the lambdoid suture. So it forms joints with a lot of these other flat bones of the skull. Here is a lateral view of the skull, and again we see the frontal bone. We see the right parietal bone. We now see a good view of the temporal bone. The temporal bone forms more of the lateral aspect of the skull. It also forms some of the inferior portions of the skull. The temporal bone has a little more structure to it. It has a rounded protuberance right behind the auditory canal, and this process is known as the mastoid process. The mastoid process serves as a point of attachment for muscles. When we learn about muscles that move your head, a number of them attach to the mastoid process in order to move the head. We see a rounded tube-like passageway known as the external auditory meatus. That obviously must have something to do with your sense of hearing. We often call that the auditory canal. We see slightly below that external auditory meatus and slightly anterior to it is a pointy process, not known as the mastoid process, but known as the styloid process. So here is where Kupke has made a mistake. So what I'm going to do is fix it. So that process is known as the styloid process. A stylus is a pen. If you've ever used a stylus, say on a tablet, stylus is often used to refer to a pen. So this process is very pointy, like a pen. It is also a point of attachment. There's a number of ligaments that attach to that styloid process that help stabilize this joint here, known as your temporal mandibular joint, or the joint that allows your mandible to move. We have to stabilize that joint using some ligaments that will attach to the styloid process. There's another mistake that I'm going to correct. This structure is known as the mandibular fossa. So a mandibular fossa obviously must have something to do with the mandible. It's not on the mandible, it's on the temporal bone. A fossa is a depression. So the mandibular fossa is a depression for the mandible to articulate in. So this mandibular fossa helps form a joint with the mandible. Again, that joint is often called the TMJ, which stands for temporal mandibular joint. That joint happens to be the only freely movable joint in the skull. So that mandible is the only bone that moves significantly. Next bone is known as the occipital bone. It forms much of the posterior wall of the skull. It also forms much of the inferior portion of the skull. The occipital bone, and as you can see, there's a couple other bones here. These are extra bones that might form, called sutural bones. Not everyone has them. On occasion, these bones, when they come together, form smaller little bones in the actual suture. So the occipital bone has one dramatic structure known as the foramen magnum, which means hole that is very large. That foramen magnum, as you can imagine, allows the spinal cord to go up and attach to the brain. So that's known as the foramen magnum. It's actually not the largest foramen or hole in the skeletal system, but it is fairly large. On each side of the foramen magnum, there are condyles, and we mentioned what a condyle is previously. It's a fairly large, smooth, rounded surface that forms a joint. So the joint that it forms is known as the axial occipital joint or occipital axial joint. What this refers to is the fact that this occipital condyle forms a joint with the atlas. The atlas happens to be the name of your first cervical vertebra. So this is what allows your skull to attach to your vertebral column. In the next video, we're going to talk about the sphenoid bone, which is this fairly strange looking kind of bat-shaped bone centrally located in the skull.